with, you began the briefing with another statement of condemnation of the continued fighting in eastern Ukraine, and in particular, you cited the more than 200 instances of violating the ceasefire. Why is it not time to declare that the ceasefire has failed, since there have been so many violations of it?
Well, Arshad, one, I think as we've talked about from the beginning, our focus remains on supporting the implementation where we can see this implemented. And obviously, we continue to call, as our partners do, for Russia and Russian-backed separatists to implement the agreement, an agreement that they signed onto. We continue to believe that a diplomatic solution, that a solution that would include the implementation of everything from moving weapons back to moving separatists back to abiding by, to releasing prisoners is the right path forward. At the same time, we also, while we're focused on supporting the implementation, we continue to have discussions internally and with our partners about additional costs, and more will be imposed unless Russia and the separatists implement the agreements.
How long are you going to give this? I mean, it's been, since Saturday night now. It's a full 5 days. Clearly hasn't worked. Is this something that you're going to let run for weeks?
I don't have a timeline for you. I can assure you that the situation in Ukraine, the violence that we see, the fact that we highlight each day what we're seeing as violations speaks to how concerned we are about what we're seeing on the ground, and discussions internally continue.
And is the principal focus of the discussions internally at the moment additional costs in terms of economic sanctions, or does it include the possibility of lethal assistance?
The same options that were options a couple of weeks ago remain options today.
Yeah, I wanted to
On
clarify.
Ukraine?
Yes, you
Okay.
said that there were 250 violations. Were they by the separatists, or that the total violation by both
Separatists,
sides?
yes.
Since September.
Since September.
Since February 15th.
Oh, so February 15th.
Yes.
Since
agreement.
Saturday.
Yes, since Saturday.
250.
Yes.
Do you have acknowledged before that there have been violations by the other side as well? Do you have a tally of how many times? Is it zero?
I do
According
not.
to-
I think one of the challenges we hear and have here, Matt, and obviously I reference the Ukrainian government because they are the ones who have said 250 violations, is that the OSCE, while they've confirmed ceasefire violations by the Russian-backed separatists, they don't have access to a number of these areas. They are the independent evaluator of these violations.
Well, the OSCE doesn't have access to Ukrainian-held positions?
To Debaltseve and some other areas where they can get a sense of what's happening. I have not seen them speak to Ukrainian violations.
Right, but if they're there to be impartial, and if there
Sure.
have been violations, I mean, and you've said perhaps understandable violations because they're defending your words, but you're defending, I mean, wouldn't it make sense to also have a count of how many?
Well, the OSCE would put out that sort of information. I have not seen them put out that information.
But the information on the 250 is from the OSCE?
No, it's from the Ukrainian
Oh.
government.
Well, that's not the same as the OSCE, right?
Correct, but the Ukrainian,
as
if
the
the
OSCE
OSCE would have access to a number of these areas, they would be able to give their own evaluation, but they don't because the separatists are preventing them from having access.
But I'm not sure I understand. It is the OSCE who is supposed to be monitoring the alleged ceasefire, not the government of Ukraine?
Correct.
So the OSCE you see as a neutral party in this, right?
Yes, as does the international community.
Right. And you see Ukraine as being neutral in this?
I didn't suggest that. Obviously,
But you're
Ukraine has a stake in the outcome
Right,
here.
exactly. But you accept their figure of 250 violations by
I
the
cited their
rebels.
figure because I
Okay.
think it's relevant information.
I'm not suggesting that it's wrong. I'm just wondering why why you're accepting it from the Ukrainian government, who obviously have a stake in this.
If there are violations being thrown out there by the Ukrainian government, then against them, then let's talk about
What
that.
sort of examples of violations were the Ukrainian authorities citing?
Well, I think we've seen a number of them, and we've cited a number of them here as well. I mean, around Debaltseve, around Donetsk and Luhansk. So there are a number we've talked about over the last couple of days.
But is it a specific shelling incident or a specific shooting incident?
Sure,
I mean,
those are all part of it, absolutely.
Are you saying, I mean, there have been occasions when rebel-held areas have been shelled, right?
Yes.
Presumably, although we don't have proof, and you called for investigations into who doing, but that presumably were coming from the Ukrainian government. Are you saying that if the OSCE had access, then they would be to the rebel-held areas, then
No,
they
I
would
was
be able to-
suggesting that the reason I cited the Ukrainian government is because the OSCE doesn't have access to these areas where the separatists are violating. If they had access, then perhaps they could evaluate whether or not these are all violations.
Would
Oh,
you say that
okay.
the ceasefire is largely holding? I know you mentioned 10 killing, 250 violations and so on, but by and large, the ceasefire is holding,
As I
correct?
said yesterday, there are some areas where it is, and there are some areas where it is not, and that is our concern.
I had a new one on Ukraine, actually.
Sure, go ahead.
I don't know if you've seen the news this morning from Russian company Gazprom that they've started supplying gas directly to the eastern Ukraine areas that are held by the rebels. I wondered what the US reaction to that was.
Well, I would first say that the surest way to ease the suffering of the people of eastern Ukraine is to put an end to the aggression by Russia and the separatist it backs by implementing the Minsk agreements. We have seen reports, of course, the reports you're referencing. I don't have any independent confirmation of those, but we certainly believe that the way to return normalcy here is to implement the Minsk agreements.
Are you opposed to them supplying gas to eastern Ukraine, given that I imagine some of it, the supplies?
Well, I think part of the issue here is there are also reports that the ongoing attacks by Russia-backed separatists have forced Ukraine's Naftogaz to halt the delivery of natural gas to the separatist-controlled areas of eastern Ukraine due to a damaged gas trunk. So this is yet another example of the hardship inflicted on the people of eastern Ukraine by the intervention here.
Do you not think it's a little cynical, given the fact that earlier this year, or probably late last year, sorry, there was a big threat from Gazprom to cut off supplies to Ukraine itself, and now they seem to be supplying an area which has put in the hands of pro-Russian separatists.
Well, and I think we have to see through what the issue at hand is here. There wouldn't be an issue, it seems, that eastern Ukraine was dealing with in terms of a lack of access to natural gas if Russia hadn't illegally intervened into that part of the country. So that's why we are where we are.
But you're not fundamentally opposed to them having the supplies, as long as they get some supplies.
Well, we certainly want, on a humanitarian basis, of course, the people of eastern Ukraine and all across Ukraine, just like we do around the world, to have access to the supplies they need. But I think the context here is incredibly important before we applaud everything. Ukraine or...
Ukraine.
Okay, go ahead.
I was just wondering if you'd seen the comments by the British Defence Secretary in which he said that Russia presented a real and present danger to the Baltic states. Is that something with which the United States agrees?
Well, I think you've seen as a NATO ally that we have taken steps to support a range of our partners in the region through visits, through supplies, through equipment, and that's something we've done not just with words, but with actions. I don't think we've put it in exactly those terms, but certainly we've taken steps to support our friends and neighbors in the region.
But do you feel that the threat to them is growing? Is there any evidence that you would want to say now that the danger to them is increasing from
There's
Russia?
no new evidence. I think, though, if you're a country in the region and you're seeing what's happening, it's understandable if you are concerned about what it means for you.
And one other question, again, about Britain. Do you have a response to the increased Russian air activity around Britain? The RAF had to escort 2 more bombers out of near Russian British airspace.
We've certainly seen that. I don't have anything new to add from here, though.
But would you say that increased NATO intercepts of Russian aircraft is worrying? I mean, do you see it as an escalation or just an annoyance?
I wouldn't call it that. I think the UK has spoken to it. I don't have anything to add from here.
Why isn't Russia's direct involvement in carving off pieces of Ukraine, including through the use of its military force as well as by supporting the separatists, additional evidence to suggest that Russia's other neighbors, such as the Baltics, are under greater threat?
Didn't I just say that we have taken action not just with words, but with supplies, with support, with visits in light of what's happening in Ukraine, and that it's understandable that Ukraine's neighbors have a concern given what they're seeing happen in Ukraine.
Yeah, but the question was whether you concurred with the statement that they're under greater threat. Is your point, yes, we do, and that's why we've taken these steps?
Well, I don't think I need to put new terms on it, Arshad. We've taken actions to support them. I think that shows what we think. Good.
The intent to supply Ukraine with arms or not supply them with arms. Where does that issue stand now?
As I mentioned in response to one of Arshad's questions, we have a range of options that have been on the table for some time. No decision has been made. Any more on Ukraine?
Yeah, just a couple more.
Okay.
Was there, since the Minsk agreements were agreed to, was there ever a time that in the view of the United States, that it was fully implemented at any point?
Well, there are several components of it, as you know, including the release of political prisoners. Obviously, we haven't seen that done. There have been moments where ceasefires have been abided to in certain parts of the country. So have every component been abided to? No, I think there hasn't been moments that I recall, but there have been moments where components of it have been. Regardless, we still continue to believe that a diplomatic solution abiding by these agreements that all of these countries and the separatists have signed is the right path forward.
You've said, in the OSCE have said that it has to be a full, basically an all or nothing deal, that it has
But
to be
we've also
fully...
said that a ceasefire needs to be the first step in the process.
Okay, so, but I guess I'm still just wondering, following up on Arshad's question, if you've never really seen the whole thing implemented, then what is it really going to take to see that this is not really viable anymore?
Well, again, as I said, we've said a ceasefire needs to be the first step in the process. Obviously, that requires Russia and the Russian-backed separatists abiding by that ceasefire. And certainly, we've seen violations, many, over the past couple of days, which are greatly concerning. There are some areas, according to the OSCE, where we've seen a reduction in violence. I think our view here continues to be that a political solution, a diplomatic solution, is the right path forward. We're not looking for an escalatory path. We want to find a way to reduce the violence, to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and that's why we continue to pursue these diplomatic options.
President Poroshenko said that he would prefer a UN peacekeeping force in the region. Is that something that you see as desirable or even viable?
Well, we have certainly seen his comments. We have not seen a formal request from the Ukrainian government. Any formal request would have to be considered in close consultation with our partners and obviously as part of a UN process.
Just more broadly, and I don't expect you to have an answer to this, but perhaps you could take it to your
Okay.
legal people and ask
Sure.
them. As you know, the relations between Russia and the United States and its major European partners were supposed to be governed by the Budapest Memorandum. Does the administration believe that that memorandum is basically gone and is no more? And if it does, or even if it doesn't, is there any way to resurrect it short of an end to the violence and the return of Crimea to Ukraine?
I'm happy to take it and talk to our legal team about it, Matt. Ukraine? Sure, go ahead.
Do you feel there's perhaps a greater chance that the ceasefire might be observed now that the separatists have achieved their immediate goal of taking Debaltseve?
Well, I think that's assuming we know what their goals are. And I
That was their
think,
immediate goal.
well, fair enough. But I think what we've seen is continued aggression and an unwillingness to abide by even agreements that they've signed with countries from the international community. Certainly, the door is open for them to abide by this agreement, but, actions speak louder than words here.